Most men in South Carolina end their marriages with a screaming match on the front porch, or a cold manila envelope from the family court sitting in the mailbox. I'm different. I found the expiration date of my 17-year marriage beneath the damp, gray concrete blocks of my own basement. They say quiet men are only quiet until they're not. I never believed in shouting, throwing fists, or making a scene. When someone decides to quietly dismantle your entire life, you don't get mad. You get organized. Welcome to Dad's ultimate payback. If you believe that hard-working men who give everything to their families deserve respect, and if you love seeing arrogant betrayers get exactly what they earned, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel to support the spine of men who refuse to bow down. Drop a comment below, letting me know which state you are watching this from. Whether you're listening in Texas, Georgia, or right here in Florida, trust me, you are going to love it here. Now, let me tell you about my wife. My name is Garrison Vance. I am 53 years old, and for over 2 decades, I've worked as a county bridge inspector right here in Beaufort County, South Carolina. My world was simple, predictable, and structurally sound. My daily companion is a dark olive drab 2021 Chevrolet Silverado 1500. I'm the kind of man who wears a faded Carhartt jacket, coaches the Beaufort Knights youth football team every Saturday morning, and keeps his tools perfectly greased. If a neighbor needs to borrow a John Deere riding mower, they come to my garage. I was the anchor. Every single winter, when the coastal humidity dropped and the cold air rolled in from the Atlantic, I was the one who woke up early to check the tire pressure on my wife's car. I spent 3 weekends hand sanding and sealing the pressure-treated pine steps of our backyard deck, just so her summer heels wouldn't catch on a rogue splinter. I knew her patterns by heart. I knew she was highly allergic to chia seeds, but absolutely loved premium orange blossom honey in her morning beverage. I built my life around protecting her. I thought that was what a husband was supposed to do. Her name was Scarlett. She was born and raised in an old-money neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, and she carried herself with that flawless, elegant Southern charm. To the community, she was the perfect woman. She organized the annual charity drives at our local church, spent her Tuesday afternoons tending to her hydrangeas while listening to true crime podcasts on her Spotify, and every single Friday night at exactly 6 p.m., she would light a cedarwood-scented candle in the living room. We had been together for 17 years. 17 years of shared dinners, quiet Sunday mornings, and coastal vacations. I looked at her every single day and genuinely believed I was the luckiest man on the Atlantic coast. I thought I knew the woman sleeping next to me. I thought she loved the life we built on that quiet, tree-lined street in Beaufort. I let that illusion sit for 17 years. I let it breathe. I had no idea that while I was checking her oil and fixing her deck, Scarlett wasn't just living with me. She was calculating the exact weight it would take to bury me. And it all started unraveling on a freezing Tuesday in February, the absolute worst month of the year. It was a chilly Thursday evening, February 12th, to be exact. Scarlett had driven down to Charleston for a 4-day charity drive hosted by her church guild. I was alone in the house with Duke, my old yellow Labrador. Honestly, I was living my best bachelor life. I had a thick ribeye steak sizzling on the charcoal grill out back, the porch light cutting through the South Carolina fog, and the NFL Network playing on every screen in the living room. It was peaceful, the kind of slow, unbothered comfort a man works 40 hours a week to earn. I felt completely in control of my castle, but like I said, I'm a structural engineer. I analyze systems, and I know that the most catastrophic structural failures always begin with a minor, unnoticed defect. Around 8:15 p.m., the temperature inside the house began to drop rapidly. I walked over to the hallway wall to check our Ecobee smart thermostat. The screen was blank, but the digital logs showed it had been accessed remotely from an outside IP address just 20 minutes prior, Scarlett's address in Charleston. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. I figured she was just adjusting the settings from her hotel room because she always complained about the house being drafty. What I didn't know, what my friend Bo from the insurance bureau would help me uncover later, was that she hadn't just adjusted it. She had pushed a forced firmware override to the system, intentionally overloading the furnace's blower motor to trigger a specific mechanical failure. She didn't want the heat to just turn off. She needed me to call a technician, and she needed me to call that night. Down in the basement, the furnace started making a sound. It wasn't the usual comforting hum, nor was it the standard groan and click that every heating unit makes when the South Carolina winter gets heavy. This was a low, metallic clank, clank, clank. Rhythmic, deliberate, like something heavy and iron was chewing on something it shouldn't. I didn't mess around with vac systems. I pulled up Google and typed in the closest local contractor, a company called Briggs & Sons Heating and Cooling. 40 minutes later, a white Ford Transit van pulled into my gravel driveway. The technician, a guy named Dale, stepped out. He was a classic blue-collar worker, big mustache, oil stains on his hands, and smelling faintly of black coffee and motor oil. He carried a heavy yellow tool bag. "Give me 20 minutes down there, Master Vance," Dale said, tipping his cap before heading down the wooden basement stairs. I nodded, told him to take his time, and went back to the kitchen to finish my steak. I gave him 15 minutes. Then, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Dale, who was literally standing directly underneath my feet. The text read, "Master Vance, there is a blocked passage behind your heavy-duty steel storage shelves down here. Is there anyone else inside the house with you? I can hear something strange." I actually chuckled out loud, thinking the old house was just playing tricks on a guy who wasn't used to our coastal foundations. I typed back, "Dale, buddy, we don't have a passage back there, just old foundation walls." 3 dots appeared on the screen. Then his reply came through, and the steak in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. "Sir, I am standing right against the metal shelving." I can hear breathing inside. And there are 4 heavy-duty padlocks bolted onto the outside of the door. Locks on the outside of a door don't keep intruders out of your house. They keep whatever is inside from getting out. That's not a security measure. That's a cage. I was down those basement stairs in 10 seconds flat, my work boots echoing against the concrete. Dale was standing near the far corner of the basement, his flashlight beam trembling slightly against the wall. The heavy-duty steel storage shelves. The ones Scarlett had practically begged me to keep, even though I'd suggested donating them to Goodwill 3 separate times, had been pulled about 6 inches away from the wall. Behind them was a door I had never seen in 17 years of living in that house. 17 years. It was a cheap, hollow-core wood door, painted the exact same flat gray as the surrounding concrete basement walls. If those shelves were flush against it, which they always had been, you could live an entire lifetime here and never know it existed. But it did exist. And bolted firmly into the wood frame were 4 heavy-duty master lock padlocks, their hardened steel shackles gleaming under Dale's flashlight. I stepped closer, pressing my ear against the gray wood. From the other side, faint but unmistakable, came the slow, heavy, rhythmic sound of a human being inhaling and exhaling. Breathing. Someone was locked inside my foundation, and according to the legal paperwork, my name was the only one on the deed. The heavy-duty jaws of a pair of bolt cutters make a very specific sound when they bite into hardened steel. It's a dry, metallic snap that echoes in a confined space. It was exactly 9:12 p.m. when Deputy Miller from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office cut the 4th master lock off that hidden door. Detective Mac Lane stood right behind him, his jaws rhythmically working on a plug of chewing tobacco, his eyes never leaving my face. The heavy gray door swung open. I expected a nightmare, but what we found was far more terrifying. The room was empty. Not just empty, but surgically swept. The concrete floor carried the faint, sharp sting of Clorox bleach, an unmistakable sign that someone had spent hours wiping down every single square inch to obliterate even the slightest trace of DNA. In the far corner, sitting on a plain, flattened cardboard box, was a small black JBL Bluetooth speaker. Right next to it sat a cheap, cracked track phone, the kind you buy for $20 in cash at the Walmart electronics counter without showing an ID. The breathing hadn't stopped until the door opened. It was a 3-hour audio file, set on an endless loop, broadcasting through the speaker. Detective Lane stepped into the sterile room, slipped on a pair of black latex gloves, and carefully picked up the burner phone. He tapped the cracked screen, watched the digital interface clear, and then looked up at me, his eyes narrowing under the bare overhead bulb. He told me that someone had activated the device remotely through a hidden IP address using a software application called Sound Broadcaster exactly 20 minutes prior, right when Dale was inspecting the furnace. I stood perfectly still on that cold concrete, but inside, the floor felt like it was shifting under my boots. I'm a bridge inspector. I know how structures are built, and I know how blueprints work. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a random glitch. This was choreography. Someone knew Scarlett was in Charleston. Someone knew I was home alone. Someone had planted a remote receiver in my house, waited until a licensed technician was in my basement, and then pressed a button from miles away to simulate a human hostage. They engineered the noise, they engineered the panic, and they engineered the exact moment 3 armed officers would invade my home. I was the owner on the deed, and as Detective McClane dropped the track phone into a plastic evidence bag, I realized I was no longer the victim. I was the target. 2 days later, at exactly 2:14 p.m. on a gray, freezing Saturday, I wasn't sitting in my Chevrolet Silverado anymore. I was sitting inside the interview room at the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. The room smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale, burnt coffee. Across the metal table from me sat Detective McClane. He wasn't chewing tobacco this time. Instead, he slowly laid down a thick manila folder, tapped the cardboard surface with a heavy silver pen, and looked at me with the vacant, unblinking eyes of a predator that had already caught its scent. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. The precise moment I stopped being the respected county bridge inspector and became a primary person of interest in a felony investigation. But it happened quietly, the way catastrophic failures always do. 1 minute you're the grieving, confused husband. The next, a veteran detective is sliding a printed spreadsheet across the table and asking you if you've ever frequented a remote self-storage facility out on Mercer Road, right near the highway split. I told him the absolute truth. I told him I had never set foot on Mercer Road in my entire life, but the state of South Carolina had a completely different story to tell. According to the digital logs, the surveillance timestamps, and the paper rental agreement, I had been there twice, paid in full, using crisp $100 bills. My full name, Garrison Vance, was clearly printed on the primary leaseholder line. My Social Security number was attached to the background check waiver. And when Deputy Miller used a master key to roll up the heavy corrugated tin door of storage unit 114, they didn't just find an empty room. They found a calculated graveyard of my character. Inside that unit, under the dim fluorescent lighting of the facility hallway, they uncovered 3 civilian storage boxes. Inside those boxes were 3 changes of women's clothing, heavily stained with traces of dried biological fluid, a prepaid Visa debit card issued by Ally Bank linked directly to my personal home address, and a small, glossy photograph. It was a photograph of a 29-year-old woman named Savannah Cross. She was a dancer from Myrtle Beach, a woman I had never encountered, never spoken to, and didn't know existed until her face was splashed across the local morning news broadcasts. In the picture, she was smiling at the camera, holding a drink on a sunny beach, completely oblivious to the fact that her image would one day be weaponized to destroy a man's life. Detective McClane leaned forward, the front legs of his metal chair creaking loudly against the linoleum floor. He looked at me, watching the micro-movements of my eyes, analyzing the pulse point in my neck. He told me that Savannah Cross had been officially reported missing exactly 11 days prior. He asked me, point blank, why the only credit card paying for her missing belongings was registered under my Social Security code. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the legal seizure warrant. My mouth was completely dry, and my chest felt like a concrete slab had been lowered onto it. I told him again, with a steady, quiet voice, that I had never seen her in my life. That was the absolute, unyielding truth. But as I sat in that sterile interrogation room, looking at my own signature forged flawlessly on a storage facility contract, the sheer scale of the architecture began to reveal itself. Someone hadn't just framed me for a financial crime. Someone had meticulously built a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly from a simulated hostage situation in my basement straight to a capital felony investigation. They had used my name, my money, my identity, and my house to build a cage. I didn't say another word. I didn't demand a lawyer. I didn't yell, and I didn't lose my temper. Anger is for men who didn't see the problem coming. I am a structural engineer. I just sat there in the silence, took a deep breath, and let the frustration settle deep into my bones. I let it breathe. Because I knew that whoever built this cage had forgotten one critical detail. You never lock an engineer inside a structure he knows how to dismantle. They released me from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office at exactly 1:14 a.m. on Sunday. I didn't call a cab, and I didn't ask anyone for a ride. I just walked out into the biting coastal air, got into the driver's seat of my Chevrolet Silverado, and drove back to the house on that quiet, tree-lined street. The house we had shared for 17 years. When I pushed the front door open, the silence that greeted me didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like a cold, analytical stage after the actors had gone home. The air still carried the faint, lingering scent of scarlet cedarwood candles, but the warmth was entirely gone. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph on the mantel, every shadow on the wall looked like evidence in a crime scene where I was slated to be the body. Cops usually tell people in my situation to go get some sleep, to let the system handle it. But I'm a county bridge inspector. When a structural integrity test fails, you don't close your eyes and hope the concrete holds. You look for the exact point of fracture. I didn't turn on the downstairs lights. I walked up the stairs in the dark, my work boots making no sound against the carpeted steps, and went straight into our bedroom. I stood over Scarlett's nightstand. She was still in Charleston, probably sleeping soundly in a high-end hotel room, completely unbothered by the fact that 3 armed deputies had torn her home apart. I looked at the small built-in bookshelf above her nightstand. That was her private sanctuary, the place where she kept the things she revisited, the things she wanted close. My engineer's training has taught me one fundamental rule of failure analysis. The most critical flaws are never buried deep underneath miles of earth. They are always hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary details. I reached out and pulled down a worn, hardcover copy of Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It was a book I had watched her read 100 times on quiet Sunday mornings while sipping her tea. A brilliant, calculated novel where the ultimate twist is that the narrator, the person guiding you through the story, the one you trust completely, is actually the cold-blooded killer. I flipped the worn spine open, and as the heavy paper pages fanned out, a small, square piece of glossy photo paper slid loose and drifted onto the comforter. It was a Polaroid. I picked it up, my thumb avoiding the edges, and held it under the dim beam of my pocket flashlight. Savannah Cross, the missing 29-year-old dancer from Myrtle Beach. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, smiling directly at the lens with the Atlantic Ocean rolling behind her, looking like a woman who had no earthly idea her face was being used as a weapon to bury an innocent man. I turned the Polaroid over. Written in the back cover area, in Scarlett's precise, elegant cursive, the exact same handwriting she used to sign our anniversary cards, was a routing number for an offshore account and a short, chilling directive. Phoenix. 60 days. I didn't yell. I didn't smash the nightstand, and I didn't break down into tears. I just sat heavily on the edge of the mattress we had shared for nearly 2 decades, staring at that small square of glossy paper. Every dinner, every family barbecue, every vacation, every single morning I had kissed her forehead before leaving for a 7 a.m. budget call. It was all a sequence of carefully timed choreography. She wasn't just living a life with me. She was calculating the exact gravitational weight it would take to crush my spine under a life sentence. A profound, freezing cold settled deep inside my chest, moving through my veins like ice water. The woman sleeping next to me for 17 years had never been there at all. She was just an architect, patiently pouring the concrete for my grave while I water her hydrangeas. But as I slipped that Polaroid into my pocket, the frustration completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute clarity. Scarlett knew my schedule, she knew my truck, and she knew my signature. But she was about to learn that she never, ever knew my spine. Scarlett returned from Charleston at exactly 4:22 p.m. on Monday afternoon. The moment the tires of her white Lexus crossover crunched against the gravel driveway, the performance began. She burst through the front door, her designer handbag dropping heavily onto the hardwood floor, and rushed toward me with the precise choreography of a devastated Southern wife. She threw her arms around my neck, her body trembling with what looked like pure panic, buried her face into the chest of my flannel shirt, and began to sob. "Oh my God! Garrison! I drove back as fast as I could! Meredith called me and said the sheriff's department was here. Who would do this to you?" Who is trying to destroy our family? She held my face in her hands, her eyes welled with real, unblemished tears. I looked deep into those blue eyes, wrapped my arms around her waist, and pulled her body close against mine. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the entryway, holding my wife of 17 years and focused entirely on the left side of her chest. I counted. 72 beats per minute, perfectly steady, smooth, unhurried. That wasn't the erratic, pounding pulse of a terrified woman whose world was collapsing. It was the resting heart rate of an engineer who was watching her blueprinted bridge withstand its first minor load test. She was entirely in control of the room. I didn't break. I kept my voice low, thick, with a carefully manufactured exhaustion, and patted her back. "I'm okay, honey. Take a deep breath. The police, they're just having a hard time understanding how old houses are built. It's all just a misunderstanding." I let that response sit for a moment. I let it breathe. The real trap, however, was sprung 48 hours later during a quiet Tuesday dinner at our kitchen table. Detective Mac McClane had returned to the house to follow up on the Mercer Road storage logs, sitting across from us with his yellow legal pad. Scarlett had prepared a fresh pitcher of traditional Southern sweet tea, heavy on the ice. She sat right beside me, our chairs pressed together, her fingers tightly, protectively interlaced with mine. She looked directly at McClane, squeezed my hand until my knuckles turned white, and let out a soft, fragile sigh. "My husband has been under an immense amount of pressure lately. Detective," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of heartbreaking concern. "His job inspecting the old county bridges. It takes a heavy toll. Garrison has been so forgetful these past few months, missing appointments, misplacing his keys. Sometimes he even gets up and goes for these long drives in the middle of the night while I'm asleep, and he doesn't remember where he went the next morning. But I know my husband. I know his heart. He's a good man, even if his mind is getting tired." It was a masterclass in legal sabotage dressed up as marital devotion. Sitting there in the warmth of my own kitchen, listening to her soft Georgia accent, I realized the terrifying depth of her chess game. She wasn't just trying to frame me for a missing persons case anymore. She was actively building a psychological paper trail right in front of the lead investigator. By painting me as a confused, cognitively failing old man who suffered from nocturnal amnesia, she was perfectly legitimizing the forged signatures on Storage Unit 114. If the police found my fingerprints on the clothing, she could argue I did it in a fugue state. If they arrested me, she could step in as my legal guardian, declare me mentally incompetent under state law, and assume absolute control of my trust portfolio and our $1 million life insurance policy without a single objection. She was laying the concrete for my asylum walls right over the dinner plates. I didn't interrupt her, I didn't flinch, and I didn't pull my hand away. I just took a slow sip of my sweet tea, looked at the woman I had built my life around, and felt that absolute, freezing quiet settle over my spine. She thought she was writing the final chapter of my ruin. She had no idea she was just giving me 20 more minutes of recorded evidence. I didn't call a high-priced family lawyer, and I didn't storm back into the house to demand answers. When you discover a structural crack in a massive concrete pier, you don't hit it with a sledgehammer. You quietly measure its depth. I needed someone who knew how to map out a hidden fracture, so I called Bo Montgomery. Bo and I had been close since our freshman year at Clemson, and today he works as a senior financial fraud investigator for the National Insurance Crime Bureau. We didn't meet at my house, and we didn't meet at his office in town. At 11:30 p.m. on a rainy Wednesday, I drove my Silverado 30 miles outside Beaufort County lines to an old, grease-stained roadside diner off Highway 21. We sat in a faded vinyl booth under the hum of a flickering neon sign. I didn't say much. I just slid a heavy cardboard box across the table containing 10 years of unredacted joint bank statements, tax returns, and my personal 401k retirement portfolio. Bo looked at me, took a slow sip of his black coffee, and pulled the box into his lap. "Give me 24 hours, Garrison," he said quietly. I nodded. I let that silence sit for a moment. I let it breathe. The call came exactly 26 hours later, at 1:42 a.m. I was sitting in my dark garage, a cold wrench in my hand, waiting. When I answered, Bo didn't greet me with his usual warmth. His voice was flat, heavy with the specific, clinical tone men use when they are delivering bad medical news. "Garrison," Bo said, the sound of papers rustling over the line. "This thing is far more architectural than we estimated. Scarlett is a ghost in these ledgers." He explained that Scarlett had been brilliant. She knew the federal banking thresholds by heart. She deliberately avoided large, lump sum withdrawals to completely bypass the Bank Secrecy Act, the federal mandate that automatically triggers a suspicious activity report to the IRS for any transaction over $10,000. Instead, she had been running a methodical, low-velocity bleeding operation. Over the last 7 years, she had been systematically withdrawing small, unnoticeable amounts. $450 here, $800 there. Almost entirely using out-of-network atoms at Remote Pilot and Love's truck stops scattered along the Interstate 95 corridor. But the financial hemorrhaging didn't stop at cash withdrawals. Bo traced those fragmented funds straight to an anonymous shell company registered in Dover, Delaware under the name Savannah Rose LC. Delaware is a corporate haven where beneficiary identity laws are locked behind an iron curtain. You can't look up the owner's name without a federal subpoena. But Bo found the destination accounts. Over a 7-year period, Scarlett had quietly siphon-fed exactly $84,200 out of our household equity and my retirement savings directly into that shell entity. And then Bo dropped the heavy timber that broke something deep inside my chest. He told me the very first irregular transfer, a quiet wire of $350, was dated exactly 14 months after our wedding day. I hung up the phone, stepped out of the garage, and stood entirely still by the window, looking out at the dark backyard. 14 months after our wedding. I remembered that exact timeline. 14 months into our marriage, we were still living in our first cramped apartment in Savannah. I remembered spending an entire hot Saturday afternoon helping her tape the baseboards and roll a fresh coat of sage green paint onto our living room walls. I remembered kissing her forehead, our hands covered in paint dust, laughing because we thought we were building our first true home together. I believed I had found my anchor on this earth, but the ledger didn't lie. 14 months into our vows, while I was working 60 hours a week to fund her lifestyle, Scarlett Vance was already mapping out the financial blueprint for my execution. She wasn't just a distant wife going through a rough patch. She was a patient, cold-blooded specialist who had spent nearly 2 decades turning my identity into a weapon and my life savings into her private exit fee. She had studied my habits, calculated my blind spots, and prepared a $1 million life insurance trap before the paint on our first walls had even dried. I stood there in the absolute freezing quiet of the South Carolina midnight, my eyes fixed on the garden she loved. I didn't get mad. I didn't feel fear. I just got organized. I needed to establish an operational buffer, a strategic breathing room where Scarlett believed her blueprint was moving toward a flawless conclusion. On a dry Thursday morning, I told her I was suffocating under the weight of Detective McLean's shadow, and that I needed to drive up to my brother Wyatt's horse ranch near Dayton to clear my head. She didn't hesitate. She looked at me with those soft, heavy Georgia eyes, smoothed the collar of my flannel shirt, and whispered that I should take all the time I needed. It was a perfect display of manufactured empathy. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Wyatt at a worn oak table, the air smelling of gun oil and timber. Wyatt spent 18 years as a scout sniper in the Marine Corps. He is a man who speaks in short, declarative sentences and views the world entirely through the lens of tactical exposure. I laid out the bank statements and the Polaroid of Savannah Cross. I told him I wanted to take the files straight to a defense attorney. Wyatt slow-poured 2 mugs of black coffee, shook his head, and looked me dead in the eye. "Garrison, you hire a defense lawyer now, and the legal noise will force her to pull back into the shadows. We don't want her playing defense. We need her comfortable. We need her to believe she's already won." Wyatt didn't hand me a standard commercial wiretap or a cheap digital recorder from Best Buy. The enemy was clever. She knew how to look for ordinary anomalies. Instead, he pulled a military-grade quartz microchip audio receiver from his safe. It didn't broadcast a live, continuous radio frequency that could trigger a digital RF sweeper. It was a passive unit, silently recording high-fidelity audio directly onto an internal micro SD card. On Saturday afternoon, while Scarlett was out spending 90 minutes at the local Target Supercenter, Wyatt and I went to work. It took us exactly 4 minutes. We didn't touch the bedroom or the kitchen. We walked straight into the sunroom. The isolated room at the back of the house where Scarlett always locked herself away every Thursday afternoon to conduct what she called her private book club chats. We carefully embedded the tiny black sliver of quartz deep into the rich soil of a large, decorative potted cedarwood plant. It was a plant she had personally picked out at a nursery 3 summers ago, one that had remained untouched for 40 months. By day 19 of the investigation, the concrete was dry. On a hot Thursday evening, I told Scarlett I was heading out to grab a couple of local beers with Beau. Instead, I drove exactly 4 blocks away, killed the headlights of my Chevrolet Silverado under the shade of a massive live oak, and opened the closed-circuit audio interface on my laptop. The quartz feed was crystal clear. The warmth I had lived with for 17 years was entirely gone from her voice. It was replaced by a flat, clinical precision that sounded like a prosecutor reading an indictment. She was speaking to her cousin Meredith. "Garrison has absolutely no idea," Scarlett said, and I could hear the clink of her ice water over the line. "He's just Garrison. Still the same naive, sentimental engineer who thinks love fixes structures. Detective McLean is tightening the perimeter around him every single day. The girl, Savannah Cross, is perfectly secure in Phoenix. I personally handed her $20,000 in cash to change her name to Amber and stay completely dark for 60 days. The moment that window closes, the state will indict Garrison for kidnapping and capital murder. The house, the trusts, the $1 million policy. It all reverts to me under the civil forfeiture exception. By next spring, we'll be living in San Diego." And then she laughed. It was a light, airy, genuinely amused sound. The laugh of a woman who had just looked at her husband's grave and found the design aesthetically pleasing. I sat there in the dark cab of my truck, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the leather steering wheel that my knuckles turned white against the dashboard lights. My pulse didn't spike. My breathing didn't change. Anger is for men who are surprised by the fracture. I am a bridge inspector. I had just watched the structural pillars of her 17-year lie collapse into the dirt, and all I felt was the quiet, freezing clarity of the final move. She knew my signature. She never knew my spine. The smoking gun in a complex conspiracy is never delivered by chance. It is hunted down, paid for in cash, and locked in steel. On a dry Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days after listening to my wife laugh about the architecture of my destruction on that quartz microchip audio feed, I quietly emptied $5,000 from a private savings account. I handed it to Carl Upton, a retired Columbus homicide detective turned private investigator whose entire personality resembled a steel filing cabinet. I gave him the Polaroid of Savannah Cross, the faded cursive handwriting that read, "Phoenix, 60 days, and a single mandate. Find her before the clock runs out." Carl didn't waste time with phone calls. He boarded the first commercial flight out of Charlotte Douglas International and landed in Arizona with a precise target. It took Carl exactly 36 hours of boots-on-the-ground surveillance to locate Savannah Cross. She wasn't buried in a hidden bunker. She was hiding in plain sight, registered under the alias Amber Rose at a mid-range commercial hotel along Camelback Road in Phoenix. But Carl didn't go into that hotel lobby alone. He brought along a certified Arizona mobile notary, a licensed official equipped with a legal stamp that transforms ordinary words into a binding, federal instrument. When Carl stepped into the air-conditioned hotel lobby and slid into the vinyl booth across from Savannah, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He simply laid a heavy, 3-inch cardboard folder on the table. The cover read, "Conspiracy to frame an innocent citizen and intentional falsification of capital evidence." The moment Savannah Cross saw the official seal of the mobile notary and the detailed surveillance logs Carl pinned to the table, her entire composure dissolved into the linoleum. She wasn't an hardened criminal. She was just a 29-year-old dancer from Myrtle Beach drowning in high-interest credit card debt who thought she was playing an easy, high-paying game of hide-and-seek. She suddenly realized that this wasn't a harmless insurance scam designed by a wealthy Southern housewife. She was looking down the barrel of a federal indictment for conspiracy to frame an innocent man for murder, a felony carrying a non-negotiable 10 to 15-year stretch in a maximum security prison. Under the cold glare of the Arizona sun cutting through the lobby window, she broke completely. Through a blur of frantic tears and shaking hands, Savannah Cross spent the next 45 minutes dictating a meticulous, 6-page confession. She detailed exactly how Scarlett Vance had approached her at a coastal bar, how Scarlett had paid her $20,000 in clean cash to disappear, and how Scarlett had masterminded the entire operation. She confessed to giving Scarlett a vial of her own biological fluid, drawn weeks prior during a routine medical procedure, so that Scarlett could personally smear it across the civilian clothing inside Storage Unit 114 to simulate a violent struggle. It was an absolute, devastating revelation of premeditated malice. When the mobile notary pressed her heavy steel embosser onto the final page, leaving a raised, indelible legal seal on the document, the ultimate weapon was forged. It was an affidavit under penalty of perjury, a piece of paper with absolute gravity that no high-priced family lawyer could ever dismantle. Scarlett had spent 17 years studying my signature, believing I was just a naive engineer who couldn't see past the structure in front of him. She had no idea that while she was waiting for her 60-day timer to expire in Phoenix, I had already laid the foundation for her absolute, legal annihilation. I had her signature, I had her confession, and now I had her spine. The final move in a calculated counterstructure is never loud. Revenge is loud, but justice? Justice is exceptionally quiet. On Friday evening at exactly 8:15 p.m., I prepared a standard ribeye steak dinner, just like I had done 1,000 times before. Scarlett was sitting across the room in her favorite velvet armchair, casually turning the pages of her book, looking like the picture-perfect image of a devoted Southern wife. At exactly 9 p.m., while standing by the kitchen counter, I used an untraceable encrypted email account to send 2 compressed files directly to her private phone. The first was the high-fidelity audio recording from the sunroom where she laughed about my destruction. The second was a crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph of the notarized legal affidavit signed by Savannah Cross in Phoenix, stamped with the crimson ink of the Arizona state seal. Her phone emitted a soft, brief chime. I watched her from behind the kitchen island as she reached out, picked up the device, and tapped the screen. In 17 years of marriage, I had never seen Scarlett Vance stand completely, utterly frozen. She was a woman who was always arranging, adjusting, and managing the world around her. But in that single heartbeat, every micro-muscle in her face locked into rigid stone. Her skin turned a violent, bloodless white, and her fingers trembled so hard the phone almost shattered against the hardwood floor. She slowly lifted her eyes, staring across the room at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at me and realized that the naive, simple engineer she thought she was burying was actually a ghost who had been standing behind her the entire time, quietly rewiring her trap. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology. And I didn't break the silence. I simply looked back at her, let out a tiny, calm smile, took a slow sip of my red wine, and carefully washed my dinner plate in the sink before walking upstairs to sleep. That is the most brutal form of psychological retribution, leaving your enemy alone in the suffocating quiet before the concrete drops. At exactly 8:45 a.m. on Tuesday morning, the coastal fog was thick enough to blind a driver, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The silence of our tree-lined street was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy crunch of gravel as 3 marked Beaufort County Sheriff's patrol cruisers pulled into our driveway, their blue emergency lights painting the frost on our windows. Detective Mac McLean pushed the front door open, flanked by 2 armed deputies. He didn't ask questions this time. He unclipped his steel handcuffs and read from a warrant charging Scarlett Vance with 14 criminal counts, including identity theft, grand larceny, tampering with material evidence, obstruction of justice, and felony conspiracy to frame a citizen. As the steel cuffs clicked tightly around her wrists, the elegant southern facade disintegrated. She spun toward me, her eyes wild with rage, her mouth opening to scream a curse. But Detective McLean firmly gripped her shoulder, cutting her off. I walked out onto the front porch, the freezing Atlantic wind ripping against the heavy fabric of my flannel jacket, and stood right beside my Chevrolet Silverado. Before they guided her into the back of the cruiser, I stepped forward and slipped a folded piece of paper into the pocket of her coat. It was a certified copy of a temporary restraining order on assets and a formal filing for a fault-based divorce under South Carolina law, citing egregious criminal malice. By utilizing her criminal indictment, My financial team had successfully frozen every single joint account, checking ledger, and trust fund connected to my name before the sun came up. She was completely wiped out. Under the strict rules of civil asset preservation, she didn't have access to a single penny of my estate to post her bail or retain a high-priced defense attorney. The elegant woman from Old Money Savannah was going to face a capital criminal trial relying entirely on a public defender appointed by the state. The ultimate, humbling nightmare for an arrogant socialite. I stood on the driveway and watched the red taillights of the patrol cars disappear into the freezing South Carolina fog. Scarlett thought she owned the blueprint of my life because she knew how to forge my signature, because she knew what time I went to work, and because she watched me sleep for 17 years. But she made one fatal structural miscalculation. She spent nearly 2 decades watching what I did, but she never once understood what I was thinking. She spent 17 years building a prison for me, believing I was too sentimental to notice the walls. It took me exactly 19 days to put her in one. She knew my signature, but she never, ever knew my spine. If you found satisfaction in seeing a hard-working man protect his legacy and dismantle a lifetime of deception, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more raw, real, and family-centered stories of justice. Thank you for standing with us at Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one. On Friday evening, at exactly 8:45 p.m., I prepared a standard ribeye steak dinner, just like I had done 1,000 times before. Scarlett was sitting across the room in her favorite leather armchair, casually flipping through a novel under the warm glow of the floor lamp, completely unbothered. She looked like the picture-perfect image of a devoted Southern wife. At exactly 9 p.m., while standing by the kitchen counter, I logged into an untraceable encrypted email account. With 2 clicks, I sent 2 digital files directly to her personal cell phone. The clean, high-fidelity audio recording of her sunroom conversation with Meredith and a high-resolution photograph of the 6-page notarized affidavit signed by Savannah Cross in Phoenix, stamped with the red legal seal of the state of Arizona. The phone on her lap chimed. I watched her from the kitchen island, a linen dish towel in my hand. In 17 years of marriage, I had never seen Scarlett Vance go completely motionless. She didn't blink. She didn't breath. Every single muscle in her face froze into a rigid, pale mask as she stared down at the glowing screen. The phone trembled violently in her hand, nearly slipping onto the hardwood floor. When she finally raised her head, her eyes met mine through the kitchen dimness. There was no anger left in her expression, only a raw, primal terror. She looked at me and realized that the sentimental, naive husband she thought she had trapped was actually a ghost standing right behind her, holding the structural keys to her destruction. I didn't say a single word. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology. I let that absolute silence sit for a moment. I let it breathe. I simply offered her a faint smile, took a slow sip of my red wine, placed my clean plate in the drying rack, and walked upstairs to bed. It was the ultimate psychological execution, the freezing quiet before the judicial storm. The storm made landfall at exactly 8:45 a.m. on Tuesday morning. The South Carolina coastal air was cold enough to freeze your breath as 3 marked patrol units from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office pulled into our gravel driveway, their blue lights silently painting the pine trees. Detective Mac McLean walked through the front door with 2 armed deputies, carrying a signed arrest warrant. Scarlett was arrested right in the entryway, facing 14 distinct criminal counts, including identity theft, grand larceny, conspiracy to frame an innocent citizen, and obstruction of justice. As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around her manicured wrists, she turned to me, her eyes bloodshot and wild, her mouth opening to scream a curse. But Detective McLean firmly guided her toward the door. I walked out onto the front porch, the freezing wind catching the collar of my Carhartt jacket, and leaned against the tailgate of my Chevrolet Silverado. Before they put her in the back of the cruiser, I handed her a small folded sheet of paper from the family court clerk. It was a certified copy of a temporary restraining order on assets, coupled with a formal fault-based divorce filing based on criminal malice. Under South Carolina law, every single joint account, our household equity, and my trust fund were instantly frozen. Scarlett was wiped out clean before she even reached the county jail. She didn't have access to a single penny of my money to post bail, and she couldn't afford to hire a high-priced private defense attorney. The elegant daughter of Savannah Old Money was forced to rely on a heavily overloaded, court-appointed public defender, the ultimate humiliation for an arrogant elite. I stood on the gravel driveway, watching the red taillights of the patrol cars vanish down the tree-lined street into the morning fog. The silence returned to Beaufort, absolute and clean. Scarlett thought she owned the blueprint because she knew how to forge my signature, because she knew my daily routine, and because she watched me sleep. But she made one fatal miscalculation. She spent 17 years watching what I did, but she never once understood what I was thinking. She spent nearly 2 decades building a concrete prison for my life. I dismantled her entire world in exactly 19 days. She knew my signature, but she never knew my spine. If you stayed with me until the very end and want to see more arrogant betrayers get exactly what they earned, join our community right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with another man who values honor. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know how you feel about Scarlett's final sentence. Thank you for standing with us, and thank you for being a part of Dad's ultimate payback. I will see you on the next one.